Yandere Simulator is an as-of-now unreleased game that began development in 2013, where you play as a yandere girl who tries to stop a series of women from daring to do something as dastardly as dating the dorky dude you've decided is dutifully yours. With murder. It's also a development horror story that should be told to all aspiring game developers, or just people trying to go into the games industry in general. Now, I wouldn't quite classify myself as being in the games industry, as I haven't gotten a job in the industry yet. However, I am in my last year of university in preparation to enter the games industry. And also, I'm a massive weeb who doesn't shy away from being said massive weeb. So I do feel somewhat qualified to talk on this subject. And the subject is that Yandere Simulator is a fucking train wreck of awful time management, an awful developer attitude, an awful story, a game concept that's been done before and better, and just in general being awful. It's also, however, just that little bit inspirational to me as someone who is also shit with managing their time. That even if I'm an absolute huge joke that can't build a game that I should have been able to build in 3 to 4 years in nearly 7, I still have a shot at millions of fans and thousands of dollars a month on Patreon if I just pitch the right kind of concept to an audience of young impressionable weebs like myself. And throughout this video essay, perhaps I can convince you that this is truly as inspiring as it is awful. Now, when I first started writing this script, I hadn't really watched any other videos on this subject and was just writing from my own observations. And then I did watch other people's videos on the subject, and while I came to the same conclusions on my own as a lot of other people did on their own, holy shit. The rabbit hole of garbage was a lot deeper than it first seemed. I'm not even going to touch on the spaghetti coding of the game beyond this mention, partly because other people have already done that in videos that I'll leave in the description, and partly because I'm not a coder. I'm going to focus on fields that I'm competent in. Now, for those of you who are here because they're fans of Yandere Simulator, I was, at one point, also a fan of Yandere Simulator. I was interested in the game's development, and I thought that the creator was a proper indie developer who knew what he was doing. Sorry. That was when I was in early high school and an impressionable teenager, and being in university kind of seemed like a distant dream. I'm now in my early 20s, in my final year of university in a Bachelor of Creative Industries degree with a major in serious games design, and I've also become more aware of when someone is trying to manipulate me. And with all of those new experiences and hindsight under my belt, that kind of tipped the scales out of the developer's favor. I stuck around a long time, even by cynic standards, because I naturally believe the best in people. I believed a lot of lies that he told about his character being defamed, and I'm fairly sure at one point I did say that I would stick by him. But there eventually does come a point when enough is enough. When incompetent development is enough. When manipulating your audience is enough. When you can't defend an absolute train wreck of a work ethic in a person, and you need to get out. And I honestly recommend that other fans at least listen to me. Because at this stage, it seems like Yandere Simulator is a game grabbing a hold of your hand and dragging you along for the ride that never ends. And yes, I did nearly finish this video, rewrote my script so it wasn't as garbage, and redid the entire video, even though I was very close to finishing the original one, so I guess I'm not that much better. Yandere Simulator began development around 2013, based on a 4chan comment made by the developer, Alex, aka YandereDev, describing the idea of a Yandere Simulator to other 4chan users. However, it seems like that comment is also the entire game design document, which isn't great because it's a few sentences long and has an incredibly informal structure, but also no plans beyond a basic outline. That would be more befitting a short, one game a month outline similar to Ben Yahtzee Crowshaw's Dev Diary series, not a massive, years-long indie project. Yandere Simulator, however, as YandereDev will inform players at every turn, is not a short, one game a month project, but it's an attempt at being a complex AAA big game with the budget of an indie title and a development team of one egotistical human and a bunch of semi-credited volunteer work. Work that could easily be paid for, given how much he makes on Patreon and how professional he wants the assets created to be, to the point where he's actively destroyed people's self-esteem for giving him work, free work, that he sees as subpar. Already we can see some pretty hefty issues, even beyond YandereDev treating his unpaid volunteers like shit. The fact that I and a lot of other people aren't exactly sure who's doing YandereDev's animations and art for all his game. Oh, the artist has also been caught tracing art for, professional assets for the game, by the way. The fact that he's trying to create a AAA title on a distinctly not AAA budget, and to top it all off, the way updates come out and just seem to bounce around the place with little structure that seems to indicate that there's almost no game design document to speak of. Just whatever comes into YandereDev's head and what he thinks would be a good update. It took 4 years for any sort of blood recognition to be added to a game about murdering people. 4 years for blood recognition. Oh, but one of the rivals got 3 new designs because we clearly needed that at that point. Even worse is it's incredibly rare to ever see YandereDev ever scope down his game and remove fairly useless features, such as, find the charm for this girl's phone case and it'll be attached to her phone later. Wow, technology! In fact, he'll keep on lumping more gameplay features because he seems to think that gameplay depth and complexity is to lump a whole bunch of useless gimmicks onto the game, which is what I'm dubbing Ubisoft sandbox syndrome. When you're developing, you should be making sure your basic features are working first and the core gameplay loop is playable as intended before you go and add world-building details. The phone charm detail is really only a tiny detail that a couple of players will notice and go, huh, neat, before never really paying it much attention again. In other words, it's a detail that's not at all essential to the game's development and slowed down the addition of major features such as implementing the actual story to this fuckfest. You, the audience, now have 5 seconds to name a game where tiny little details have objectively made a game excellent on their own, with no good or interesting gameplay or story to go with it. Go! Time's up! If you couldn't think of any, then congratulations! You've understood, or almost understood, the point I'm trying to make. YandereDev largely refuses to take any community feedback on his game, despite live blogging, live journaling, live whatevering his entire development process in order to fund the game. And that's resulted in game development taking much longer than it would a competent game developer. Not only that, but it's negating the one benefit of live blogging your development process. Well, one of two, the other being able to make a shit ton of cash on Patreon. About the most we've gotten in terms of an actual description for the intended gameplay is a cross between Hitman and Persona. However, these games are incredibly difficult in terms of mechanics, and neither are that effective at describing Yandere Simulator. A more accurate description would be Hitman, but it takes place in one location, a school, for the entire game. And that just does Yandere Simulator the disservice of being a worse Hitman game with a female protagonist. And you know what the internet does to those kinds of concepts. Because the two games described are so vastly different, it allows YandereDev to essentially make the gameplay whatever he likes in that generalization, and he can't be criticized for it, but can also add in ridiculous things like rhythm matching minigames, cooking simulator games, 2D fighting games, quick time eventathons. Oh, he added like some sort of fucking sabotaging the vending machine mechanic recently, because we clearly needed that. He can add pretty much whatever he wants, and he can say that it matches his vision for the game. And it can't be criticized because it matches his vision for the game. But that's absolutely bananas. Look, I'll show you what I mean. My game, Clown Fucking Simulator 2020, will have gameplay that's a cross between Danganronpa and Left 4 Dead 2, and has minigames inspired by Fallout New Vegas and Age of Empires 2. It's fairly easy to make a totally detached claim about what your gameplay is supposed to be described as. It's not so easy to write out exact plans, and it seems like YandereDev hasn't even decided to bother with planning out his game. So we've got huge ambitions for what Yandere Simulator is going to be, but no game design document to reference or any sense of scope. I think that the best way we can describe how that's going to go is a modern Icarus story, if we're being charitable. If I can say what's on my mind, however, this is going to be a fucking disaster. Most people are aware of one of Yandere Simulator's most recognizable characters, Midori Gurin, represents. She represents the audience of Yandere Simulator whenever they dare to do something as heinous and horrible as ask questions that any reasonable human being would probably be wondering, make a suggestion for the game of any kind, or show any kind of engagement with the game that isn't, I love this game is amazing, and I made you this highly detailed fan art of your characters. Oh, what terrible hardship YandereDev must endure, having 2 million fans of his unreleased game, which would ensure that if it ever does get released, he's almost guaranteed to make bank, even if the game is ultimately shit, which it is almost guaranteed to be, in all honesty. It's not like there's people out in the world who'd commit murder to have a fraction of a fraction for that for their own projects. My own envious side, YandereDev gets away with insulting his audience on a fairly regular basis because he has fairly reasonable questions, read out in a voice that makes them sound ridiculous, who, as far as I'm aware, is another volunteer voice actress, before he responds in a calm, slow voice of his own, and then he murders Midori, usually brutally. I'm gonna give you a quick demonstration of how ridiculous and cruel this is.
Kaide, what do you use to record your audio most of the time?
I use Audacity to record my audio when it's not live commentary in Vegas Pro. And my microphone is a blue snowball attached to the cheap extension stand that I bought off eBay with a cheap pop filter over the top of it. Now die. And don't ever have the audacity to ask me questions about my content creation again. Stab, stab, stab.
Oh no.
You
They
are dead. Don't call again. Now, frustration with one's own audience and the reactions to your content aren't anything new, nor am I implying that you should always be 100% grateful for everything your audience sends you. Some comments I got on my videos are kind of pet peeves of mine, but I've also never depicted myself murdering my audience at all, let alone publicly. I generally just don't respond if the comment is my pet peeve, but leave it for other people to see, though I do remove outright offensive contents. YandereDev has, however, repeatedly depicted himself murdering a representation of his audience. There's not wanting questions asked, and there's turning the hostility you feel towards an audience that you've quite frankly taken for granted into a running gag on your channel. There's also the fact that YandereDev oftentimes has an almost strangle-like hold on what you can say about his game in front of him or on things he controls, to quite frankly embarrassing degrees. If you say anything that implies Yandere Simulator is anything less than the greatest thing to grace our mortal plane this century, he'll delete your comments, and he's even disabled the ability for anyone to comment for long periods of time in the past. There are fans out there who offer legitimate criticism that is meant to be constructive, and he's been caught responding to these fans, saying that they need to fuck off for questioning him, and just desperately trying to filter content in ways you can't really do as a larger channel. You're going to get criticism as your project gets more recognition and your fanbase gets bigger. It's unavoidable. You do not have to take all that criticism on board. However, it's also not acceptable to berate your audience for providing time out of their lives to give criticism on your game. Kappa Kaiju goes more into detail about this in his video, so I'll link it in the description below. I briefly touched on this issue in section 1, but I want to expand on it. As said prior, this game began development in 2013, with YandereDev supposedly working full-time on the project, but not really though, of working himself most days and hitting immense regular crunches. With a development time and attitude like that, the game should have already been released by now. It should have been released for several years, in fact. Hell, any competent indie developer who didn't overwork themselves and didn't do crunch time probably would have released the game by now. In fact, let's not beat around the bush, they definitely would have released it by now. However, as we've discussed already, YandereDev is not a competent game developer. In fact, he's one of the most incompetent developers that I've ever seen in hindsight, and that includes myself, a bitch who can barely code a game in fucking Choi script. Alex's game can be produced much cleaner and better by fans of his game, and the proof is in Watashi no Mono, a Yandere Simulator fan game that started development about 4 years after the development of Yandere Simulator started, and has not only caught up to and gone past Yandere Simulator's development state, but looks much more polished and unique. It's not from a lack of resources either. YandereDev's had plenty of access to resources that could have easily helped him along with his development, and a lot of it being volunteer work. However, he's proven incredibly difficult to work with. His partnership with tinyBuild fell through due to the fact that he refused to compromise on his vision at all, refused to cooperate with tinyBuild, and eventually got dropped by tinyBuild for those reasons. That's because YandereDev has an absolutely massive ego. One that prevents him from listening to his audience when they provide critique or ways to improve the game, or as already established, murders a caricature representing the audience for daring to question his creation. YandereDev refuses to ever believe that someone might have something insightful or helpful to apply to his project, and treats all criticism of Yandere Simulator as a personal attack, unless it might make him look good to accept it. When he does accept criticism, which is usually things he was thinking anyway, he makes a massive video announcing, "I decided to take your criticism on board. Aren't I generous? Those gremlins are destroying my reputation with lies, and the proof is I took one person's criticism on board." The project also spends a lot of its development time in bug fixing and useless meme modes for the game, which is time that could have been easily spent going towards implementing key features or working on the core gameplay loop and fleshing them out properly, or implementing proper end states for his game rather than just a series of game overs. And no, contrary to popular belief, you do not have to remove bugs in every stage of the build. Where YandereDev is at now is called an alpha build, which is typically where you're adding in your core gameplay features and fleshing those out, and bug fixes don't come until the beta build, which YandereDev is nowhere near at, and probably won't ever reach, given how many new features he bolts on that don't add to the central gameplay loop. People have pointed out YandereDev's terrible project management skills, and I'll bring up that now that he took at least several months after the fallout with tinyBuild to even announce the deal was off to his fans and viewers. His development of Yandere Simulator is full of missteps and mistakes that indicate heavily that he cannot manage his time or his project effectively, but also refuses to accept any help or guidance on his project due to his ego and need to protect his vision. These are two things that, when mixed together, end poorly. I know because I have similar issues, but at least my inability to seek guidance is because of my social anxiety, not because of my fucking ego. I want to bring up some other games that had extremely long development times. Daikatana, a game by maker of Bitches and trans rights daddy John Romero, is an infamous example of a game that had a long extended development time from the initial promised development time from 8 months to 3 years. And it was infamously bad. It was also mysteriously absent from when YandereDev was bringing up games that also took a long time to develop. The same applies to Duke Nukem Forever, which took a ridiculous 13 years to develop, and was also strangely absent from YandereDev's video about how long development takes for a game. Well, not that strangely, it was also absolutely horrible. Originally, Yandere Simulator was to get a crowd fundraiser in 2016 and released in 2018. We're now well into the second half of 2019, we're nearly in 2020, and no fundraiser, no game. The game's barely progressed at all in development since the announcement. YandereDev did cite that Cyberpunk 2077 also didn't have a concrete release date, but that was at a time when the game was in its extremely early stages of development. Now Cyberpunk 2077 does have a release date, 16th of April 2020. YandereDev still doesn't have a date when we can expect the first rival of the game, let alone the full game. Yandere Simulator has been in development for almost 7 years. By this point, nothing will be able to live up to the hype generated. Especially not a game with such a basic premise and not adding much else to the table, because YandereDev's taken the EA approach. No competition, or the only competition being fan games, means you don't have to care. However, EA have gotten their comeuppance several times. SimCity 5 got its comeuppance with City Skylines. The Sims 4, while I love that game, looks about prepared to get its comeuppance with Paralives. If this sort of unethical development of Yandere Simulator continues, then eventually a game better than it in every way will come around and be released. And it does look like Watashi no Mono will be the City Skylines to Yandere Simulator's SimCity 5. I'm gonna put up content warnings here for sexual abuse, regular abuse, and ableism. If these are things that might be triggering or upsetting, I do recommend skipping to section 6. Here's the timestamp, hopefully. Now, as a writer and someone who is both mentally ill and does their best to advocate for disabled people, this is kind of my section to talk about, so it may be a lot longer than the other sections because I'll have more to talk about. The premise and story of Yandere Simulator isn't exactly a Song of Ice and Fire. In fact, it's very basic as far as premises go. It's certainly not a story 7 years in the fucking making. I've read fanfiction more original in concept than Yandere Simulator. Unrelated note, read Defy Fate Reanimate by my friend Mel. Anyway, it's not that interesting of a take on yanderes, nor does it twist the trope in an interesting way, and it's also potentially even more ableist than most other depictions of yanderes. It also heavily excuses the main character's abuse of her victim because of her mental illness. I'm gonna call her actions towards her senpai abuse and her senpai her victim from here on out just so we're clear. So I don't actually remember the main character's name anymore, so I'm going to call her Lego Brick. Lego Brick is a girl who doesn't experience emotions and can't feel them. In other words, Lego Brick is coded as, and intended to be, a sociopath. For the uninformed, coding is when characters display traits associated with a certain marginalized group, but it's not outright said in the text that they are part of that marginalized group. For example, Rentaro Mami has Arrow Ace coding because he wears a black ring on his middle finger, which is the common signal of the asexual community, though he also has a bunch of dialogue, which indicates that he's not interested in a romantic or sexual relationship. Lego Brick's total lack of emotions and inability to feel them codes her as a sociopath. Now, we're only a few sentences into the premise and story, and we're already hitting pretty ableist themes. We got a main character, Lego Brick, who is violent, willing to murder people to keep them away from her victim, whom I'm dubbing Diet Shuichi on accounts of also not remembering his name and not really wanting to call him senpai. And also, even though Shuichi came afterwards, he is clearly the superior character here, who is also described in terms that line up with the most recognizable symptom of sociopathy. This is an unfortunately common depiction of people with mental illnesses that aren't perceived as cute or angsty like anxiety or depression. Sociopaths, people with dissociative identity disorder, and unspecified insanity, people are usually depicted as murderers in horror stories. However, sociopaths and other people with mental illnesses in reality are usually the victims of crimes, not the perpetrators. So this is another fetishization of mental illness and violence that seems to always happen with yandere characters. People who have no mental health problems whatsoever are able to be abusive and violent. People do love to say, oh, but if they were mentally sound, they wouldn't abuse people. But that implies that someone who has a mental illness is an abuser waiting to happen, which isn't fucking true at all. We're mentally ill. That doesn't mean we lack a moral compass, for fuck's sake. We're usually people who are incredibly sympathetic. Almost all of my closest friends have mental illnesses like I do, and they're honestly the sweetest people I've ever met. But mentally ill people, thanks to tropes like the mentally ill yandere, are often thought of to be scary and murderous. This might come as a surprise to writers, but you can write an abusive stalker with an unhealthy obsession with another person and not make them mentally ill. And you can have a mentally ill character that doesn't murder people for fun. Lego Brick's mother is also a sociopath who managed to murder and eliminate anyone who took interest in Lego Brick's father, kidnapped him, sexually assaulted him, and forced him to love her and only her under the threat of physical harm to him and anyone left that he still cared about. When Lego Brick's mother noticed that Lego Brick didn't feel any emotions and was a sociopath like her, she began enabling her daughter's violent behavior. This is an abusive situation that isn't really treated as such, just the quirky, tragic backstory to Lego Brick. This further upholds ableist tropes that mentally ill people are violent and dangerous. Again, sociopaths and other mentally ill people are usually the victims of crimes, not the perpetrators in reality. I know that the common argument against all criticism of anything fictional is,
it's fiction, and therefore whatever happens in it is just a vacuum that doesn't at all impact reality.
which I'll be quick to remind you is bullshit. Jaws is a fictional property, and its effects on reality are still felt today. The shark population has been in decline since the film came out, and made critical success, to the point where the writer of the original book has said that he regrets ever writing the book. The creator of Jaws regrets his creation because it impacted reality so harshly. YandereDev's audience is also fairly massive, being over 2 million people, so his fiction does have an effect on the reality and enforces the status quo of mentally ill people being violent. I don't know if sociopathy is genetic, and I don't believe it changes my point either way, but implying that being a violent murderer and being a sociopath go hand in hand, and that being a violent murderer can be inherited from the parents, is an absolute garbage depiction of these things that continues the myth that mentally ill people are violent murderers waiting to happen. My final proof of this being ableist is, ultimately, we do not see a depiction of a sociopath that is not a violent murderer. We get shy characters and reclusive characters, but we do not get another coded sociopath that doesn't violently murder people. And honestly, that much could have brought it back so much. Just one character that's a sociopath and maybe wants to stop Lego Brick's murdering spree based on the emotions of other people, and understanding that even if they don't feel that themselves, would have given the story much more depth and taken away a lot of what I'd said. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Lego Brick's sociopathy also pretty much magically vanishes once she encounters the one, i.e. Diet Shuichi, adding on to the continued ableism of the game's premise, as well as presenting some pretty anti-Ace and anti-Arrow themes to the story. That a mentally ill person's mental illnesses magically vanish with the power of love from other people, and that love will magically make their lives better. While it's true I'm so much happier with my partner in my life, it doesn't mean that I'm still not constantly anxious and overanalyzing everything I say to her or send to her, and I'm afraid that the next shit meme I send her might make her hate me because I sent the wrong thing without realizing it. My mental illnesses didn't vanish because I fell in love with her, but Yandere Simulator's premise implies that those mental illnesses can and do vanish if you just develop a crush on someone after you crash into them and start Fortnite dancing together in the fucking hallway. There's also just the, in general, sexism and heteronormativity of,
My world was so bleak and empty until a man showed up in my life.
But that seems like a moot point, and one that everyone already kind of picked up on. And then we get to the last section of the intro. Diet Shuichi has the gall, the absolute audacity, to want to date women that aren't Lego Brick. But Lego Brick wants him for herself. So Lego Brick, rather than try to talk to Diet Shuichi, builds up a friendship, get his attention by acting normal and charming him naturally, she decides she needs to go immediately from 0 to 100 because someone talked to him. She decided she needs to abuse and manipulate his entire school life and murder and manipulate any woman who even gets close to him, including his own sister, before ultimately kidnapping him and repeating her family's cycle of abuse, which isn't how abusers operate in reality. People aren't fucking oblivious. They will notice if everyone they talk to seems to be disappearing rapidly. And as a high school student, it's very difficult for Lego Brick to control Diet Shuichi's life at this stage. She's not rich, she's not got a support group to want her to help manipulate Diet Shuichi, she's not charismatic enough to manipulate people to do what she wants until she's done what they want. Lego Brick really hasn't got anything in the way of being able to properly manipulate Diet Shuichi into being and doing what she wants. It trivializes something that's very real to a lot of people and makes it into an absolute joke, and clearly doesn't understand what makes an abuser scary. Abusers don't charge forth and murder everyone in their way. They find other ways to slowly cut them off and make them think it's the victim's fault that they're leaving, or cuts their victim off from their other friends and makes it seem like it's the other friend's fault, which is honestly even scarier because the abuser's painting themselves as the only one the victim can trust without making the victim feel like shit in the process. This takes place over several months or years, not 10 weeks. So the premise is rife with ableism and romanticized and inaccurate abuse. Charitably, I'd say the story's not great. Uncharitably, I'd say that the story is absolute garbage that anyone could have farted out in a couple of weeks. I'd criticize the rest of the story, but as of writing, it doesn't seem like there is really a rest of the story to criticize. We've got the opening cutscene and physical designs for the other rivals, but it seems like the rest of the story points to the first rival and goes that 10 times with incrementing difficulty and slight changes to the one-dimensional personality the rival has. And speaking of difficulty in the first rival... While I do believe that having accessible and easily mappable controls to the games is important to accommodate players with various disabilities, in this section, accessibility is going to refer to how accessible the game is for an able-bodied player who can use the original controller and original controls, assuming the original controls aren't dogshit that need to be remapped because they're dogshit to play the game. Now, let's say by some sheer stroke of a miracle, as rare as being struck by lightning at the same time as being eaten by a shark and winning the lottery, that Yandere Simulator finally does get released and the code doesn't turn your computer into hot slag upon launching the game. Imagine this scenario. You're a new player, you've only just heard about the game, and you've paid the $15 on Steam, Origin, Epic Games Store, and another digital games distributor for an access code, because by the time this game is fucking released, physical CD-ROMs are going to be what confuses the children in Baby Boomer comics. Installed it and started a new game. We'll assume you played the tutorial, know all the controls, and some of the mechanics, because, let's face it, this game is pretty fucking bloated, and a tutorial to cover everything YandereDev wants to add to the game would probably require a fucking 13-week university course. Then you're dropped into the actual game. You don't know any of the students, really, despite having attended school with them for a full year. This is where the premise makes severe oversights in terms of both gameplay and story, and as despite the fact that you're a second-year student and you've spent at least a full year with your classmates, you don't have any established relationships with anyone, and most people don't even know who you are. Surely they'd at least know who you are. Your goal is to eliminate the first rival by the end of the week, who I'm dubbing Kokoro partly because I want to shill my OCs, partly because she's also technically a tsundere like Osana, but I put flesh on her character rather than substituting that for a funky hairstyle. Anyway, you don't know where Kokoro will be at all times on your first run-through, assuming you didn't boot up a walkthrough that tells you. From here, you have two options. Spend your entire first run-through of the game trying to memorize Kokoro's patterns for the 5 days you have to eliminate her, or do your best to kill her immediately when you get the chance. Except you don't get that chance. Kokoro is always with someone, that's how the game is designed, which is made painfully clear with every update that YandereDev brings out about the first rival. So either way you do this, you get game over and you have to restart the week. This is level 1, mind you! Let's say, by another sheer stroke of fucking impossible luck, you manage to flawlessly memorize Kokoro's pattern of movement for those 5 days, and you don't need to observe her pattern of movement again with another game over. Again, not really possible in the first run-through. Now you gotta figure out a plan to kill her. The game provides almost no freedom to change plans if one plan isn't working out. You will get game over if you don't come up with your plan on Monday morning before you've even left to go to school, and execute every part of it flawlessly to its conclusion. Not allowing players to change their plans if one isn't working out without forcing them to restart is awful game design that doesn't promote the creative thinking that you want to see in a game where you're supposed to simulate being a slasher killer. Back to the scenario. You try to follow Kokoro to the bathroom to do the electrocution method. You may or may not have seen in the tutorial, but you don't have the tools to get it done. So you have to go to the hardware club and attempt to steal the keys with a quick time event of all mechanics, which is game design shorthand for insert mechanic here. Get a screwdriver from the hardware shed, go back to the bathroom without being caught, pray Kokoro's not done taking your shit, and pray extra hard that no one comes in to see what you're doing or else restart the week yet again, unscrew the light switch cover, turn the lights out, and pour a bucket of water over her head. Only then, after all of that nonsense and extra steps that are more like chores than trying to kill somebody, will you maybe actually kill your target. And then when shit goes 5 ways to Friday, you have to hide the corpse temporarily before you can go burn it later, burn the screwdriver, and create an alibi for yourself. And that's assuming nobody else comes into the bathroom and sees what you're doing, even though now there's that new bitch who's now constantly following Kokoro everywhere and is totally immovable as of now. That was an entirely unnecessary addition to a game that already had enough mechanics to stop the player's player being able to commit the murder easily. That's for the first rival, meaning it's supposed to sucker the player in. It's still rife with multiple meaningless and boring chore steps and multiple instances of trial and error, far too many for a first-time player to be expected to follow. Players are not expected to be observant. Players are expected to be clairvoyant. They're expected to follow the development of Yandere Simulator and all the YouTubers covering the game and its secrets to know what the hell they should be doing. That's the flaw with Hitman and the fact that its gameplay is very niche. Yandere Simulator is essentially a worse Hitman game set in a single location with an anime art style, which I'm pretty sure you can do if you just fucking mod Hitman, making Yandere Simulator's existence pointless. Not to mention, it's pretty much impossible for a high school girl to realistically get away with murdering someone, especially if she's previously been emotionless or apathetic to other people's struggles, but suddenly changes her tune when murders break out that are later revealed she had a part in. You might get a miraculous situation where a player is willing to put up with borderline impossible gameplay like the Soulsborne series and Cuphead got away with, but they both had certain charms to them, an interesting world and concept of gameplay to them, as well as a completely solid art style that Yandere Simulator does not have. As it stands, the first rival elimination is basically impossible and thus inaccessible if you don't have a strict walkthrough open in another tab. People do like a challenge, but people don't like those challenges essentially being grinding or chores. Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest had similar issues with inaccessibility, with messages usually being too cryptic and no real guidance on where the player should go. Yandere Simulator has very similar issues, but at the very least, Castlevania 2 didn't imply you were incompetent and born yesterday before slaughtering a straw man version of you in its next development update video for not understanding the genius of the game, even if it could get a YouTube channel 18 years before YouTube was even a thing. The fact I've referenced so many bad games in their development processes and drawn many direct comparisons between those game processes and Yandere Simulator's development means this game is almost guaranteed to go one of two ways. Either it never will be released, and indeed, all of Yandere's work for the past decade will have ultimately been for nothing, with him destroying himself under his own ego and incompetence. Or the game does get released, and it's astonishingly awful and badly received even by the most diehard weebs. One last astonishingly awful game I'd like to compare it to is the now-defunct Digital Homicide's The Slaughtering Grounds. The game is infamous for its developers tanking their own company when its developers couldn't handle criticism from Jim fucking Sterling's son, as well as being almost primarily asset flips. I think the comparison I'm making speaks for itself. With so many poor decisions in its concepting stages, development, treatment of its fans, its story, and especially the entire project, Yandere Simulator is almost certainly doomed to fail. And the only reason I'm giving it any benefit of the doubt is if 10 Christs all descend from the heavens at once, and rather than sort out climate change, destroy billionaires for their sins against humanity, solve world hunger, well, all three of these would kind of lead to the other two happening. Instead, the 10 Christs use all their power to magically make Yandere Simulator an even remotely decent game. Game development isn't easy. I won't claim it is. The industry is also pretty fucked. But YandereDev's attitude towards development is even more fucked. No deadline means he doesn't have to care, and he keeps implementing minor details while core gameplay features go unfinished. He refuses to scope down or compromise remotely on his vision, and in general, he acts like a prick. As established at the start, I was once a fan of this game, and I probably stayed on the hype train much longer than I should have. But in good conscience as a game design student, I cannot continue to support an absolute train wreck of a game development process. As a writer, I cannot continue to support such a slapdash and bland story concept. As a mentally ill person, I cannot continue to support the fetishization and ableist portrayals of the mentally ill in the media. And as a human being, I cannot continue to support someone who takes everything that they have for granted and manipulates their audience into seeing someone so easy to criticize as unassailable.